Alright, so in this series of videos, we're going to look at using Adobe Illustrator specifically for doing cartographic design and map editing. In this first video, I'm just going to show you some general examples in Adobe Illustrator that aren't necessarily map specific, but just general things you'd want to know if you're going to work in the software. And then later on, we'll look at some more map specific examples and actually edit some maps that were created in our GIS software. Before we start, I just wanted to note that if you don't have access to Adobe Illustrator, it isn't free. You have to license it. There are other options. So one example is Inkscape, and on the course content, I'll have links to some material that you can use to learn Inkscape. But I'm not going to actually cover that because that material already exists. Okay, so I launched Adobe Illustrator here. It's installed on my machine. And this is the loading page where you can pull in maps or graphics that you've worked with recently, or you can create something new. So what I'm going to do is create a web page sized layout. So this is a default. It's web page 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is basically equivalent to like high definition video. So 1080p. So we click on that. It will launch into a new document, which should be blank. Oh, there we go. So we have our workspace here, and then I have some windows floating around based on how things were set up last time I was using the software. So I'm going to shut off everything so I can do a quick overview of where you can find different windows and whatnot. Okay, so first off, under File, you can open files, create new files, save files, export out. When you export out, a lot of these options are to convert it into a raster graphic of some kind. For example, you can export out to like a PNG file or a TIFF or a JPEG. So if we do export as, you can see a lot of options here. There are also some other kind of vector model or vector files that you can use, so things like SVG files. So anyway, that's just to export out. Those are the main things that I use in here. So export, save as, so on and so forth. Place can be used to add data into the space. So if I do place, you can grab a file. I'm going to just grab an image file real quick. So I'm just going to go to my photos here, and we'll just grab this image of this this bird feeder. We do place, we can dump it in there, and then we have a raster that's kind of embedded into the vector file. Okay, so that's the main things under File. Under Edit, you've got a lot of your comment editing. You can copy, paste, cut. You can paste it in front or back or in place. That has to do with things like drawing order or its position in the XY space. We'll look at some of those throughout as we look at specific map examples. So for example, you can change the color palette and whatnot. Object menu generally relates to objects. So things that are objects on the page, things that you've drawn, shapes, whatever, text, things like that. So for example, if I'm just going to really quickly draw a box, and that's an object, and then we could manipulate that object when it's selected using the objects menu. So for example, if we do rotate, we can specify an angle here and rotate the object about an axis. We could go in here and do a scale and change the size, like 75. Makes it a little bit smaller. So move obviously moves in XY space. So those are transformations. Arrange has to do with the drawing order. So generally by default, things are going to draw on top. The newer things that you draw will draw on top of things that are already drawn unless you're drawing into specific layers. If you have multiple objects, you can group them. This can be useful for editing something like as a single unit. So for example, if I wanted all of these objects to be treated as a single object, then I could, just grabbing the selection tool here, highlight all of it, and then if I go to Object, Group, now these things act as a group. And so for example, now if I went in here and did a scale, and we're just going to bump it up to like 120%, then they all get rescaled because they act as one object. And then if you wanted to ungroup them, then you can go to Objects, Ungroup, and it should split them back into individual features, as you can see there. Okay, so again, we'll look at some specifics here when we actually do some map editing, but a lot of this has to do with manipulating individual objects. The type menu relates to type, right? So changing fonts, font sizes, font color, so on and so forth. So you can, let me just make a font or some text here. And as you can see, it fills it with lorem ipsum, which is like placeholder text. So if we wanted to do some editing on this, we could go to type. We could, for example, increase the size. Note when you have a box and you get this little red arrow here, what that means is that you've overflowed the box, right? So you don't have enough room to print all the text at that font size. So we can expand it a bit so we know that we have everything, and then that little red object or symbol will disappear. All right, so once you have text and it's selected, then you can go in here and change other things. So for example, we could pick a different font, changes the font. We already looked at size. You can convert your fonts to like paths and whatnot. So in short, this menu relates to your fonts. Selection is to select objects. So for example, all selects everything, right? All on active artboard, that's if you have more than one artboard, it'll just select what's active in that specific artboard. Deselect deselects everything. Inverse will take what you will invert your selection. So for example, if I just selected this object and I did select inverse, it'll flip and everything will be selected except that object. All right, so that's what that does. You find font can be used. Oh, actually, I'm still wrong menu. Okay, and then effects are things like applying specific effects to objects, like for example, stylize, blur, sketch, textures. We're not really going to use a lot of that for our map design. That's useful though if you're drawing from scratch or whatnot. The view pane will allow you to open up menus to do specific things. So let's look at some of the, or sorry, that's not what that does. That's the windows. View relates to your view, so you can zoom in, zoom out, fit artboard to window, so that makes it zoom to the artboard, so your entire artboard or space fills the window extent. You can also turn on rulers and guides. Some of these are useful, like smart guides can help you with aligning things, for example. So anyway, that's that. And then windows is what I started talking about a minute ago. This opens up windows that are for specific things. So some common ones that you'd work with are like properties. So this opens up the properties menu, and it'll show you the properties for whatever you're clicked on. So whatever's selected. So let me clear the selection here and just select this text. So now we can see what properties are applied to this. We have a fill color, no stroke applied, which is the outline. It's 100% opacity, so there's no transparency applied. This will list effects that are applied to that specific object. Then here we have the font, the regular italic bold, which what's listed there will actually depend on the font you're using. Font size, leading, kerning, that type of stuff. Justification, so we could like convert this into center there. So that's a really common tool to use. So or window to use. So if we click on something that's not text like this, we'll get different properties because it's a different type of object. So for example, we could go in here and change the color, the fill color. We could change the stroke color. We could change the stroke width. We could change the opacity, and there's some other options in there. You could add effects, rotate it, transform it, its scale or its location. You can also do that under the objects menu. Okay, and then lastly we have help for documentation and whatnot. You can sign into a Creative Cloud account if you have one of those. Okay, so let's talk about some of the, okay, let's just leave this here for now, and then we come back, we'll look at some of the tools that are available for just simple drawing and manipulation.